So I am thrilled to be here today. My name is Cynthia Kaiser. I am a Deputy Assistant Director with FBI Cyber Division, and I'm joined here by wonderful panelists, all of whom are experts in this specific cyber threat. So if I can go around and have you introduce yourselves, and then we'll go ahead.
I'm Shara DeGrippo, Director of Threat Intelligence Strategy at Microsoft.
I'm Andrew Scott. I'm the Associate Director for China Operations at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency.
And I'm Morgan Adamski. I'm the Director of the Cybersecurity Collaboration Center at NSA.
Great. And, we're all thrilled to be here with you today to really share our stories and some of the deeper insights that we have into the PRC-based actor Volt Typhoon. Now, since 2021, PRC Volt Typhoon actors have been pre-positioning for disruptive and destructive cyber attacks against U.S. critical infrastructure in the event of a major crisis or conflict with the United States. We know their targets include numerous sectors to include communications, manufacturing, utility, transportation, construction, maritime, government, IT, and education. And this includes the development and pursuing the development of capabilities that could disrupt critical infrastructure communications between the U.S. and Asia in a time of crisis. So I want to go through, maybe turning to you first, Sharad, and talk us through, the first days and weeks of identifying some of this activity at Microsoft. What was some of that atmosphere, among everybody there?
Sure. We have really talented and dedicated threat researchers and intel analysts working at Microsoft on both the crimeware side and the nation-sponsored side. And this was mid-2021, as you mentioned, and we have threat researchers dedicated to a variety of landscapes. And this particular group of researchers started discovering activity that was...
1 second, technical difficult. I have a hand mic, see? I went special.
All right.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Smart.
Okay.
I'm fine with it. So I think what we found was that this activity was very concerning. And threat researchers and intelligence analysts, as they're looking at this kind of activity coming from the signals that we have within Microsoft, it looked very concerning. And they were curious, and it sort of started spinning up more activity from researchers looking at what's going on. And I think it's an atmosphere that becomes very heated and excited, not necessarily in a positive way, but excited in an urgent way. And that was sort of the atmosphere upon finding some of this activity.
And, Morgan, at the same time, NSA starts getting first indications, bringing the community together around some of the activity. Can you walk us through, from your end then, your early days collaboration with the private sector and across the U.S. government?
Yeah, so at NSA, when we think about nation-state cyber actors, specifically the PRC, we start to characterize their activity based on the infrastructure that they use, the personas that they develop, the tradecraft that they hone, and kind of demonstrate every time they do an operation. And that's really how we start to do attribution, figure out who's responsible for an activity. So when it came to Volt Typhoon, as was previously discussed, we really started to see a unique activity and something different in that August 2021 timeframe, specifically tied to the Pulse Secure event, where we saw a lot of exploitation of those edge devices. And they were against, if you remember, the US Coast Guard, maybe some of you remember, produced a report about a compromise to the Port of Houston. That demonstrated a really different type of activity, and we really wanted to better understand it. So when we saw that activity, great colleagues across the US government, obviously, and our private sector partners with Microsoft, we were able to characterize and say, okay, how do we pull this apart? What do we see in this specific compromise that is different from the PRC actors? What is the infrastructure? What are the various TTPs they are using? How can we partner with industry? And so what we started to do, and this tends to be how most of our stories go right now, is we brought in different types of industry partners who had different insight, different telemetry, different capabilities, and said, okay, what do we know from the internet service providers that track infrastructure? What do we know from the EDR providers that are looking on network and seeing these attacks against their customers? And how do we take those bits and pieces of information? Hey, we saw some of this similar activity. There's not a lot of bespoke malware used. How do we characterize it? And so we worked that for what seemed like a very short period of time, but it was a longer period of time because we still didn't have all the pieces of the puzzle, which really came to the point of that big May event, right, May 2023, where you saw the cybersecurity advisory from the US government, where we had put together a hunt guide based on what we had seen against this activity over a number of months and years, and said, okay, how do we find these adversaries in critical infrastructure? And we did that through the insights of our private sector partners like Microsoft, who had great visibility and understanding of the actor. And we said, okay, now we need to really start the campaign. Most people think of a cybersecurity advisory, it's like, oh, it's the end. We know the threat and this is how you fix it. It was really the beginning for us as we went and decided that we would need to really think about Volt Typhoon in a different way.
And backing up just a bit, Andrew, to when CISA and FBI are also entering this, becoming aware of the broader campaign, and starting to do a little bit of our engagements, especially on Guam. Can you walk us through, how CISA was handling some of these issues?
Sure, absolutely. So just to build on something that Morgan mentioned, the type of tradecraft we're seeing here, and we'll discuss this more as we go, is really fundamentally different. And so it requires actually to detect and uncover the activity, having some level of access to the network itself that might be compromised and victimized. And so from CISA's perspective, as NSA, Microsoft, FBI, and others were working through this, we became aware of potential victims on island and Guam. And at CISA, we think a lot about, and we talk a lot about things like incident response and threat hunting, but we have other capabilities as well, specifically in a subdivision of ours called vulnerability management that does work around sort of doing remote pen testing and really building out the understanding of what might be happening on an entity. We had a team that sort of looked specifically at a couple of different entities on island and Guam, and from that uncovered sort of a cascading series of intrusions that we were deeply concerned about that in turn led to actually deployment of IR resources on island and Guam, actually throughout a typhoon, if you can believe it.
Yeah, and I think through a lot of that, just like multi-agency footwork that's going on island at the time. People are going out, they're talking to all the critical infrastructure. We're starting to give everybody a common threat picture, and it's at that time that the FBI received a request to send an incident response team, what we call a cyber action team or CAT team, to a private critical infrastructure company on island. So even though I think as you're looking at a purely forensic standpoint, we weren't able to definitively tie the activities to the Volt Typhoon actors, taking into account the timing, the proximity, the similar tactics, and other indications, we assessed it was highly likely that it was Volt Typhoon actors who were conducting this compromise. Now, throughout the deployment, we had found that the actors were using multiple types of proxy tools and stuff that's natively found and natively like in Windows to be able to navigate, to go in and out, and to try to move laterally across the network. One of the first proxies that we identified is something that you could just download from the internet, Fast Reverse Proxy, or FRP, which is noted in a lot of the CSAs that we later published. And this tool is used by the actors in several instances to establish covert communication channels for its command and control infrastructure. Now, that became a really good foothold for us. Like, we said, okay, we know from partners that Volt Typhoon actors are, using these tools, that there's indications from outside the network that this tool may be in use. So let's go looking for it here, and then we can fan out, and we can identify, either the tools, the proxies themselves, or evidence of the use or execution of those proxies on a number of systems, and find out what was actually compromised from there. And among some of the other tools that we found, we did identify the use in this particular deployment, or at least attempted use, of Mimikatz for trying to obtain credentials, as well as a fair bit of Impacket use, which, especially one part of the Impacket tool suite that acts like a very similar native Windows tool to help an admin, or in this case a bad actor, execute remote processes. So we're looking at these tools, and especially interesting, though, we find is that we were successful, the actors were successful in identifying networks that were typically segmented from each other. So, basically finding that common point between networks and using those native tools to establish essentially bridges between one network and another. They really were quite adept at figuring out how to go across these networks, and was it exploratory versus an intentional movement? I think forensically that's hard to tell. It doesn't end up mattering in the end, but I think they were really good at moving across what would be considered by the victim to be completely walled off or segmented networks, but maybe there was an admin there was one system that they used to go between the systems, and the Volt Typhoon actors were able to find that particular system, to find that one area and exploit it and move further. And I think that that's really different from some of the other incident responses that we've done, in that it was an actor who was adept at going across these networks that had been purposely built by the victim to be more secure. Now, Morgan, you kind of mentioned May 2023, and I want to go back to that. What was some of the U.S. collaboration to build out the picture that ultimately led to both the blog post and the CSA?
Yeah, I can speak to the CSA portion, right? So when you talk about the U.S. government, and obviously my colleagues here on stage, we all have different insights, capabilities, and authorities, right? So from an NSA perspective, we obviously focus on the foreign intelligence, the foreign space, and so we have great understanding of plans of intention at times on what our adversaries are trying to do. But when you want to connect that to an actual victim's notice and or victim's network and be able to validate that they're actually in there, that's where we really have to partner closely with our FBI and CISA colleagues. And we also need to have conversations with all of the net defenders, because we can produce a cybersecurity advisory or technical advice on something on how to secure a network or how to protect against an adversary. But if a network owner, critical infrastructure network owner, can't actually use it or doesn't understand it, we've got a problem. I can't tell you the amount of times that we would go and talk about Volt Typhoon, and we would talk about the cybersecurity advisory, and we would have people raise their hand and say, great, can you just send me the indicator list? And I will look through my logs. And we were like, no, that is not what we're talking about here. This is living off the land. This is about identity access management. This is better understanding when your sysadmins are actually operating on a network and when they are not. And when they are not, and you see them on your network, it's likely the Chinese. So you've got to focus in on that. And so for the cybersecurity advisory, I think it was really beneficial for us. We had built it over a couple of months as we were following the adversary, at least from an NSA perspective, and then we were able to collaborate with FBI and CISA to enrich it and make it better, and then we were able to talk to our industry partners with all their insight and just make it a better product to go out when it was in tandem with the Microsoft blog. And so I think that collaboration was hugely impactful, but what most people don't realize is if you go to page 3 or 4 in the CSA, there are at least 11 industry partners that are acknowledging to contributing to that product because they wanted to collaborate, they had some understanding of the adversary, and they offered it to the US, to critical infrastructure owners, so that they could have a better picture. It was everybody's technical expertise, and I think that is the huge impact of operational collaboration and how valuable it was with Volt Typhoon, because we would not have found the adversary otherwise if we had not private sector collaboration against that threat.
That's right. Can you walk us through maybe some more on the blog post side, like what's going on behind that, like how you're putting all that together?
Sure. I think one of the things that threat intelligence absolutely hate doing is writing blog posts. So when we do get them saying, you know what, we've got to do a blog on this, it means that something is really urgent. And I think in this situation, Volt Typhoon was absolutely seen as something urgent because from a threat intelligence perspective at Microsoft, we can't infer the motivation of that threat actor. We don't know why they're doing it. We don't necessarily know what they're after. We can guess. But ultimately, looking at the targets for Volt Typhoon, they didn't have a significant amount of intelligence espionage value. They had disruptive potential value. And if you look at the name of Volt Typhoon, does anyone in here remember when Microsoft did a big change in their naming scheme? About a year ago, we moved away from elements because there are only 118 elements. There are a lot more threat actor groups than that. And so threat actor names that end in Typhoon are Microsoft's association with China. And we pick that first modifier, each one for a different group. And Volt, I think most people can sort of associate refers to particular kinds of critical infrastructure. So pulling all of that together after that naming convention, convincing the Intel analysts to go through the blogging process, work with Morgan and her team, I think it was very successful. I think we had a very successful rollout all at once together with that, which is really important to show that the public and private sector are tracking these actors in a collaborative way.
Andrew, then kind of, we have the CSA, we have the blog post out there. Turning to you maybe a little on what happened after that. How was the U.S. government in that space working towards this?
Mm-hmm. So a couple things. I mean, one, as Morgan and Sherrod mentioned, what we're talking about here is really fundamentally different kind of tradecraft being employed by a nation state against critical infrastructure. So a huge amount of energy was just spent getting the message out about what we were seeing, what kinds of tradecraft was being employed, and what kinds of measures those concerned about it need to be put in place, because as Morgan mentioned, there are no indicators of compromise. There's no automated defenses. This is about sort of really defending through the basics of identity management, access management, baselining your network, understanding what's out of band, and so spending a huge amount of time just doing that. But that started to change sort of over the course of the summer and really into the early fall for us, through partnership with industry partners, including Microsoft, starting to understand that what we saw on Guam and what we've been working on from the February timeframe forward really represented a much broader campaign of targets and moving beyond just outside of the United States into potential critical infrastructure inside the United States. At which point, a very different mindset and very different sort of set of urgency being brought to bear. For myself, I served in the Obama administration and was in the White House Situation Room during discussions around OPM. And I distinctly remember the point at which we realized everything was gone in OPM. You can imagine what the thought process was when we realized, oh goodness, there are compromises in multiple critical infrastructure sectors inside the United States, and we need to get after that problem.
Yeah, I think, and I know we had a lot of interagency teams coming together and trying to go through all this data. So I think one of my analysts likened it to being on a super team, where every single person in the room, this was their passion. They were able to, dive deep into this, and what they really said is like, gosh, it was really fun to be able to geek out with all the other super geeks, and and the way we were putting these teams together, and other agencies were putting these teams together, is to take people with a lot of different specialties. So a specialty in metadata analysis or NetFlow data analysis, host-based analysis, or even specialized tools like Splunk to be able to do the bulk data analysis necessary to try to find anomalies, because it was so hard to find these actors. I think the private sector really came in too to a lot of this, being able to share out data and reports from consensual monitors, and we were able to take that data and then say, okay, let's go back and look at our own intelligence sources. Okay, let's go talk to some more experts over here. And it was this iterative, really involved process that included a ton of real-time communication across all of us to be able to get to that point. I think most of the members of these review teams were deep subject matter experts on China, and that really helped them look for patterns of behavior that they saw were suspicious. So because Volt Typhoon's using proxy networks, maybe you're looking through something that is enumerating the network, or so time analysis, or you're making Boolean queries and the tools to help you identify suspicious behavior from an admin account, or identifying things like strange connections coming in. I think it's important to just really think through. The actors aren't downloading some kit, and it's really you can only find some of the anomalies that we're able to find from actors doing the living off the land through pattern-based analysis, and you can't necessarily do that without the subject matter expertise of great people in the room.
And if I can just pick up on that for a second, and talk about the partnership that was built over sort of a number of months. We had, as Cynthia mentioned, partners and teams across the U.S. government and also working with industry to really illuminate sort of where did we see risk and make decisions about who is going to take lead on which victim, on which entity, on which sector, to then make decisions about which expertise and tradecraft do we need to employ. And what that led to was, CISA had multiple teams across multiple sectors get deployed over a period of time. And as Cynthia noted, that teamwork that we built allowed our team to go from, in the first instance, it was a couple weeks, to go from identifying we think there's a problem on the network to saying Volt Typhoon is confirmed on the network, to by the end of it getting there inside of 24 hours because we knew what to look for. And as we'll talk about more, we knew what to look for because there was a common pattern of behavior happening that allowed us to trace it down and really drive discovery much faster, which then in turn leads to the need to update the CSA on February this year.
Yeah, and one thing I would just offer is that, we saw the video in the beginning. One of the key things that happened after the blog posts and after the first cybersecurity advisory, and then as the victim notification started from our colleagues, is that we found that we had to over-communicate, but with all levels of the government, right? We had to have conversations with CEOs and CISOs and acquisition, the people that manage contracts, to help them better understand this is the threat and this is why you should care about it. And this is why you need to have the right network architecture and things in place, and here's what you can invest in, all the way down to the technical teams, so the geeks, so they could geek out and actually understand the threat and how to get after it. And you had to balance all of those conversations. Credit to our CISA colleagues, they led an effort with all those sector risk management agencies where we had to do outreach to all of our various sectors, and that was hugely impactful as well, because all we started to really do was make people aware of how significant this threat was, why it was important to our national security and our US critical infrastructure. And quite honestly, once we started to do that, more and more tips started to flow in. And I think that was really helpful for us because we started to look at the tip of the iceberg, which may have been a little depressing, but we also were able to really start to find different opportunities to go find more facts, find more details about their behavior, and that helped us to build an even stronger story for future cybersecurity advisories.
And I think at the same time, though, we're getting all these, we're getting more tips in and we're getting more buy-in. There still were some victims where we went to them and they didn't quite understand that because Volt Typhoon's so good at being invisible, not finding something doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, and that's one point we always make when we talk about Volt Typhoon is because it is an activity where you're pre-positioning on US critical infrastructure, you're not seeing large amounts of data leaving the network, right? They are quite honestly maybe having activity every 30, 60, 90 days, which means some people don't keep their logs that long. And so it's very difficult for you to find the adversary if you don't have logs that go back that far to even to be able to determine whether or not we see Volt Typhoon infrastructure interacting with your network. And so that was difficult to explain to people, and then we had to explain to people as well, here's the type of things to look for, and you actually have to spend a lot of analysis and capacity on this if you really want to find them, and that can be a huge investment from a company perspective, right? And so that's where we had to engage the CISO and the CEO levels.
And I think in some instances we're seeing a reflection of what's happening like throughout most of our responses, which is varying skill levels or varying aspects that come. So in one instance where we did a victim notification, we came on site and the victim had actually deployed a very expensive endpoint security solution across almost all of its network that was producing alerts for a while, and it was identifying some of the activity, but no one in the company was actually getting the alerts. So the FBI ended up being the first people with eyes on those alerts. And I mean, in all places, like some things like that are gonna happen where someone sets up a system and then they leave the company and we don't know where things are necessarily going. And it's a pretty common thing for us to show up and where we're having our initial conversations about, hey, what solutions might already be in place on this, like where can we go to get information, and it can be awkward for that company to say, well, hey, actually we do have that, but we don't know how to access it. No one's really looking at it. We'll have to get back to you. And then the FBI ends up seeing and saying, well, hey, this has been noting something for 1, 2, 3 months. And so, I think it really highlights that, we have all these like great, amazing assets and resources, and you need experts to be looking at some of these this information, but you gotta have the data to begin with, and, you know, it can vary with, you know, how long someone's keeping logs or whether they're accessing their systems. So I don't know if Microsoft's kind of seeing similar things at this time, in how it's, you know, doing some of its response to customers.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about looking at intrusions too is that it's almost like a time warp and a time machine. You have the moment that it happened, and then you have to start working backward, and then you have to start working forward. And it's very difficult in time to hold that in your mind, even with great data. Harder with data that's not great. So when you look at logs and you have like timestamp issues because one's using EST and one's using UTC, and you've got to go through and correlate all those things, that's something that's really hard. But I think, you know, we have an incredibly diligent team of intelligence analysts at Microsoft, but the combination of leveraging living off the land with residential proxies, it's just designed to obfuscate. That's really what it is. It's like an invisibility cloak. And so you have to peel back those layers. And just like you said, just because you don't find it doesn't mean it's not there. It's a needle in a needle stack. You have to keep going, and you prick your finger a lot when you're doing it. And I think that that's sort of the way that we handled Volt Typhoon was you just have to keep looking, because that is the new normal now. Residential proxies combined with living off the land, everybody's doing it. And I don't just mean Typhoon actors, I mean across the landscape, every nation, including crime.
Absolutely, and I don't know if Morgan, as part of the threat hunting, you found anything additional, like regarding all of that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think a lot of it's been covered, but what I would also offer is that, you know, it's very difficult to find Volt Typhoon, but it's also sometimes a little disappointing because we have people that have thought they have found Volt Typhoon. And what we've heard is, I mean, I don't know how many people are familiar with cyber operations in the US government, but when you think about how our cyber actors work from a PRC perspective, they're not necessarily deconflicting all their operations with other intelligence organizations. And so what we see is that we see Volt Typhoon actors operating on the same networks and doing the same type of activity as other China cyber actors. And then sometimes it's not Volt Typhoon at all, it's a different cyber actor, but they share some of the same TTPs. And so we have to spend a lot of time in conversations. You know, from a Volt perspective, obviously, we see them connecting to all critical infrastructure across all sectors for the most part. And the Department of Defense is no different. There's active targeting that's not abnormal for us. But we still see the same type of TTPs being used against DoD as we would against other sectors.
And I think, there we go, I'm doing the same thing. So, you know, going then back to like how we saw this, like as you put it really well, Sharad, like the combination of the living off the land and the residential proxies, we go into then kind of the next phase, I think, of this, which is that January, February timeframe, where the FBI has been working across all of our partners, identifying the network, and so in December to January, we sought to conduct a technical operation pursuant to a warrants under a Rule 41 authority, which authorized the FBI to seize and remove malware that was associated with the KV botnet, which is the KV malware, infecting some of these small business and home routers that the Volt Typhoon actors were using to hide their hand at a lot of this activity. So, as a part of this, we had they'd been compromising end-of-life routers so that there weren't necessarily updates or patches available to them, and it made them even more vulnerable to exploitation of the actors and an easy target for Volt Typhoon. And since these devices are typically used by private citizens or small businesses with limited IT and security resources, we realized that the malware was unlikely to be removed from the devices themselves by the owners of those devices, and so the best action was to conduct some kind of technical operation to be able to directly neutralize that type of botnet in a coordinated and timely manner here and with our partners abroad. So, we spent a lot of time though, preparing for this operation, and both to determine, how we can remove the Chinese actors, and conducting extensive testing to ensure the actions aren't going to alter the normal functionality of devices, operating system, files, and software. And we do this type of review and this type of work in a lot of instances where we see actors more and more using some of these obfuscation networks and the proxies to be able to conduct their activities. And I think in the case here, what made it really effective is not just the taking down of that infrastructure, working with our partners abroad, but then also like how we're able to work with everybody here on what's that next phase, what's the messaging, what's the timing that's right for us to ensure that this is getting out to the public, this is getting out to critical infrastructure sectors in the best way we can. And part of that was timing some of these announcements with things like a CSA. So Andrew, I don't know if you can maybe walk us through more of the process behind getting that second one developed and out the door.
Sure. So I've been asked in forums like this by private sector partners, industry partners, et cetera, with a statement of the U.S. government's been concerned about PRC cyber intrusion for 20 years. What's different now? And what's different now is what led us to the urgency behind the second CSA, which is not just that there's targeting of critical infrastructure, that there's access to critical infrastructure, pre-positioning on critical infrastructure, and most importantly, in some cases, the PRC was positioned to be able to disrupt operational technology environment on that critical infrastructure. And if you look at what our intelligence community has said, it is all oriented around pre-positioning for times of bilateral crisis or conflict. So the only thing that's missing is the order to take some action to disrupt or degrade the infrastructure. So that's point one. As soon as we were at the point at CISA where we said, okay, they're on the infrastructure, they're pre-positioned, they could do things, it meant that we needed to do something different from a public advisory standpoint. But secondarily, the fact that what we were seeing was a common pattern across multiple entities, multiple sectors, where it was the same general kind of tradecraft that was being employed. And so let me just unpack that for a second. In a very simplified way, you have a PRC actor whose mission in life, who's in Beijing or Shanghai or Chengdu or somewhere, whose mission in life is gain access to critical infrastructure in the United States. The first stop is these obfuscation networks that we're talking about, all of the various ways to hide in the noise and build out the command and control infrastructure necessary to target the networks of critical infrastructure. At that point then, it is compromise of enterprise edge devices, virtual private servers, email gateways, routers, sort of the things that are at the external part of your network that are highly trusted, highly permissioned, and set up in a way that once you have access to them, you then have access into the network. The third was kind of identification of a consistent pattern of compromise of Active Directory identity credentials, specifically doing things like going in and exfilling a file called the ntds.dip file, which is where your Active Directory domain credentials are stored, and doing it periodically. So exfiltrate the file, come back as an authenticated user a month later, and sort of be able to do anything that that authenticated user is able to do in the environment. The reality is if you're operating an Active Directory environment, how often should you be exporting the entirety of your Active Directory if you're not doing an Active Directory migration? The answer is basically never. And when we're seeing a pattern, as has been talked about before, of every 3 months, every 6 months, every 12 months, every 24 months, that pattern happening, we felt a really urgent need to sort of emphasize the point of getting that advisory out. What we did was, though, was one thing that was a little bit different. If you look at that advisory on February 7th, pages, I think it's 6 through 8 of that advisory, sort of extract some of the key things that we found across all of our work to say, if you're concerned about this intrusion activity, if you're a critical infrastructure owner or operator and you want to defend against this, here's the key things that you need to be looking at. 2 reasons for why we did that. The first is for big critical infrastructure owners and operators, ports, transportation entities, et cetera, that we wanted to make sure got that message. But the second was what we saw in the pattern of targeting and the incident response that we did was smaller to medium-sized businesses who were critical enablers of multiple other critical infrastructure entities. So really wanting to make sure that we got that message out to them as well.
And I think that segues nicely into then what some of the best practices are for living off the land detection and hardening. And so, if I can go to you, Sean, first, like what are you, telling your customers nowadays about, how do you counter some of this activity?
I'd like to tell all of you in the audience to go home and fix your edge devices. And then on the holidays, fix your parents' edge devices. We have an edge device problem on the threat landscape. It is significant, and as you mentioned, end of life is a problem, but firmware updates are a solution when you can have those. So replace those end of life devices and get them power cycled and updated. I think you have to monitor ingress and egress of networks always. Egress also, not just things coming in, things going out. And really, unfortunately, we're looking at a situation where it's very difficult to detect, and you have to be very, very vigilant. One of the things I would also, I'll speak on behalf of my public sector friends here. When one of them calls you, answer the phone and work with them. Obviously, when Microsoft calls you too. But when they call, it's a different level of urgency. So make sure that you have those plans in place when you get that call of who's responsible, who's in charge. For those of you that are in enterprise, if you do get a call from one of them, do you know what to do? Do you know who you're supposed to connect with at your organization? Do you know the playbooks and policies and procedures that govern that? You should decide those now before they call you.
So that was a great lay down. I think I'd add and appreciate the shout out for take the phone call when one of us calls you, because that's certainly been a challenge. I would just build on that by piggybacking off. I see Rob Joyce in the front row here, and I'll piggyback off of something that he said at a conference, I think it was about 8 years ago now, which is this is nation state APT activity. They know your network better than you do. And so if you want to defend against this activity, you better understand where are your edge devices, audit them. Do you have logging turned down? Do you have host-based and endpoint detection in place? Are you monitoring the logs? Are you centralizing your logs? Are you looking at your sysadmins and trusting but verifying their activity on the network? There's a whole slew of things that need to be done that is completely different than the world of indicators of compromise and sort of automated defenses. That really is, it's the boring stuff. It is the hard stuff, and it is the boring stuff to do in your environment, but it's the only way you can detect and defend against this activity.
I don't have anything to offer outside of, I did have to patch my parents' home routers because they asked,
Thank
what
you.
is this Volt Typhoon thing? And so I do agree with all of that, and obviously Andrew's point. I think one of the points that was mentioned earlier by Sharad is that your playbook for how you would act if someone calls, that includes getting all of your legal and policy teams in place so they know what you can and cannot share. But we have found, the way that we have found Volt Typhoon is that it is by people who have leaned forward and said, we're going to share everything we know and everything that's happening because this is a nation state actor. If they're coming after us, they're coming after someone else, and we want to help protect that they don't have to go through the same thing. And that's really where we've gotten to where we are today.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this activity without context, it looks totally benign. And so without experts being involved in the hunt and being able to find it, it's really, really difficult for just the everyday folks to be able to identify this. And so we want to be there to help, and we all can't find it on our own. We have to work together too.
Yep, true.
And I think I'd add one more aspect to preparing yourself for incident response. That especially if you're in a smaller company, it can be hard if you're inviting incident responders in to also take somebody or some folks of your team offline to be full-time with incident responders and have them not do their day-to-day jobs. But it's just absolutely critical for the kind of timely remediation or timely like hunt across the networks to be able to dedicate some of those resources on there. So, I mean, I think, you know, what I want to end with here is really thinking about what's next. You know, what can and should we expect next, either from us or from the actors? And maybe, you know, Morgan, I can start with you and we can come on down.
Volt Typhoon is not a this month problem. It is going to be a problem for multiple years. And we are seeing Volt Typhoon activity every single day. And we are learning about new intrusions. And so if you're not already thinking about the problem or how you're starting to set up your network architecture or how you're having these conversations or how you're hunting and finding this adversary, then let's talk afterwards. You're a little behind the curve, right? So we want to move fast. And I think that's the main thing is we're going to have to keep figuring out how to track and stay ahead of this adversary. Because when we have conversations on how we look at the way that they're using covert networks or taking down the KV botnet, that just means they're going to find a different way to get into the network. And as they change that tradecraft, the only way for us to discover and track them and stay ahead of them is through conversations between the government, the private sector, and all of you that are operating networks or sitting at CISOs or CEO board levels. It's how much are you willing to contribute to the conversation so we can stop this adversary in the future.
So I would offer, I think all of us are going to be doing everything that we can to, you know, track infrastructure, do victim notification, continue to put out guidance, and everything that Morgan just highlighted. I think one thing that has gone sort of underserved and under-talked about in all of these conversations is resilience. And that stems from the fact that what we are identifying and what we're talking about here is part of a strategic goal by the PRC to be pre-positioned to disrupt or degrade critical infrastructure in a high-risk geopolitical environment. That strategic intent is going to continue. And the breadth of and scope of risk is so great that we can't perfectly defend everything every time. So now it's a conversation about resilience. And at CISO, we are focused on sort of looking at target resource poor, small, medium-sized businesses, what kinds of services can we provide to them. But I would also issue a challenge to all of you, which is building off of what Shavad said in terms of what do you do when the phone call happens. What are you doing in terms of looking at, if you're a critical infrastructure owner and operator, do you know how to fail over in a manual mode? Do you exercise it? How often do you exercise it? Do you have incident response playbooks and do you exercise them? Do you have a way of dealing with major disruption where you're trying to sort of muddle through in an environment where your IT systems aren't online? That's the kind of thing that really only all of you can do to ask the questions in your networks and in your business processes to say, are we putting the things in place so that we can operate in the event that we're the subject of one of these intrusions and ultimately one of these disruptions?
I'll just very quickly say I really think that this is all going to accelerate. It's going to accelerate because of AI. Take that exfiltrated data, train an LLM on it, and you can search it faster than you can blink your eyes. That's something that I think a lot of people need to think about. Data that's exfiltrated becomes weaponized very quickly when you apply it to an LLM. You can use natural language to query it very quickly. It gives these threat actors a time advantage that's very difficult for us to make up.
And I'd end with, I hope everybody here expects the FBI to continue to be focusing on identifying and taking down the obfuscation networks that Volt Typhoon and other actors are using to conduct nefarious activities and hide their tracks. But these actors are persistent. They're going to keep coming back. They're going to keep trying to reconstitute their operations. So a lot of the work that we do here is almost, it's entropic. We're going to be continuing to work towards taking down those operations so that we can frustrate them, we can delay them, and we can all raise ourselves up to a higher level of defense capability in the meantime. So I think, as you're looking at, yes, the work that in our technical disruption of the KV botnet, we showed the world, and more importantly, the PRC cyber actors, that we will develop and carry out innovative cyber operations when necessary. But what I hope everyone takes away from here is that in the U.S., both in government and in the private sector, we have incredibly smart people that are laser focused on, trying to counter this threat. And through our partnership and relentless dedication, we can really transform the impossible into the achievable. So thank you.